I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this, I don't know, GOP crack up. I'm sure y'all probably mentioned a little bit on MR, but there was a recent kind of spat between everybody's favorite action figure come to life, Dan Crenshaw, and the rest of the Freedom Caucus.
This has not been on MR. This is brand new content.
Oh, nice. Well, I'm happy to break it for y'all. This is just interesting. Next week, we're going to be joined by Liza Featherstone to talk a little bit about Josh Hawley and how the right is trying to use, masculinity and the kind of freak out over masculinity to their advantage. I'm really looking forward to that conversation. But Crenshaw, I think, runs in a similar kind of area as Hawley does, and I think he's an interesting kind of political force, and I think. You should be putting your eyes a little bit more on the cues and the actions that he's doing than maybe the guys who are bringing the headlines. Because I feel like Crenshaw has much more of a line in with Republican leadership and the major donors than, for example, Boebert does.
Yeah.
And I don't mean this because, like, obviously what Boebert's done and what a lot of these other people are doing is absolutely despicable. But I'm just seeing like what that party, the Republican Party, the party that controls the state that I live in, where they're like really starting to turn. And I think it's been interesting to see where people are going to push Trump. But anyways, enough introduction. This is Dan Crenshaw at an event for losers called the Texas Liberty Alliance, sort of throwing some shade at other members of the Freedom Caucus.
These two. There's actually other veterans in Morgan's race. There's other front runners. So why support these two? Well, because I've been in Congress for almost 3 years now. There's two types of members in Congress. There's performance artists and there's legislators. Now, the performance artists are the ones that get all the attention. They're the ones you think are more conservative because they know how to say slogans real well. They know how to recite the lines that they know that our voters want to hear. Let me tell you guys something. In the first 2 years of Trump's presidency, when Republicans were in control, when every single time we were voting on Donald Trump's agenda, who do you think was at the top of that list voting with Trump, and who do you think was at the bottom? A lot of names you would recognize were at the bottom of that list. A lot of names you would recognize are at the top of that list. Number two, it's probably going to make you cringe a little bit. It's Adam Kinzinger. Voted with Trump almost 99%. He was number two. But who's at the bottom? Everybody in the Freedom Caucus. All of them. What you hear so often is not true. It's not true. We have grifters in our midst. Not here, not like in this room, that's not what I mean. I mean in the conservative movement. Lie after lie after lie, because they know something psychologically about the conservative part. We're worried about what people are going to do to us, what they're going to infringe upon us.
There are probably, there's not a lot that I agree with Dan Crenshaw on, but I'll tell you one thing that is almost a truism that you could say about any kind of group of, major conservative movements in America. There are grifters among us, right? I think this is an interesting kind of clip, and the media has been, the liberals who are just so excited to embrace Republicans into their arms, obviously are having a lot of fun with this, saying like, oh, wow, Dan Crenshaw, returning us to like normalcy and truth in the GOP. Let's not forget that I think just the other day he gave a speech out front of the Capitol talking about how the Democratic Party is a better kind of spy operation than anything that the Kremlin could have come up with at the height of the Cold War. So let's not, let people get away with any of these kind of fantasies as to what Crenshaw is saying, because Crenshaw was certainly a part of this wing. And I don't find this to necessarily be Crenshaw sort of finding his spirit and his backbone, but actually sort of showing which way the winds are blowing within the Republican Party.
Yeah, Dan Crenshaw, before he was a congressperson, was a moderator of a far-right conspiracy Facebook group. This was a Tea Party Republicans one. Again, when you say far-right, you also mean like standard GOP populist.
Absolutely.
Right? But this type of stuff, like the type of things that these sorts of groups say about like BLM protests or Muslims just living lives, he was a moderator for this exact same thing with like these other sort of Pizzagate type folks, right? And you're right in the fact that he is clearly someone who has the ear of well-connected folks, right? Like they're right. The Republicans will deal with like Boeberts and Marjorie Taylor Greenes because they need that energy. And it's like tax cuts for corporations don't do that for that. And there's a certain point where like the Rand Paul type of defense libertarianism isn't really doing it anymore either, when you have Ilhan Omar and stuff elaborate. But yeah, like, I mean, I also want to quickly say, I agree. I respect the point about Kinzinger, because that's the thing about all these little guys that like to say as if they're sort of, and even they're like portrayed as rhinos, but no, like they're right there with the sort of establishment Republican agenda.
Well, I mean, I think the bigger point here is what Trumpism sort of represented, like materially, right? Not, what it looked like on TV, not what it looked like symbolically, but what was the Trump government, basically like in power. I mean, it was conservative policy on autopilot. And I think for the GOP, while they can whenever you're the party that's out of power, you can just sort of point, to like the establishment, right? But I think it is a little bit difficult to do that with Biden, because Biden is continuing so many of the worst and most barbaric policies of Trump. You don't have to look any further than the U.S.-Mexico border to see how Bidenism has actually not been this huge shift when it comes to policy, right? And you realize that, a lot of it, as Crenshaw knows better than most, that most of politics actually is about puffing out your chest and being a performance artist. So it's pretty rich to hear him say that. But
I mean, maybe we mentioned the Marvel commercials.
Do not forget, if you did not see these, I mean, he did these commercials where he was jumping out of helicopters, to fight Antifa. I mean, this is a guy who's as much of a performance artist as it gets. But what does it sort of represent? We don't really spend too much time getting worked up about, congressional politics on this show, because a lot of it really is just theater. But I do think it's worthwhile to note, why is Crenshaw doing this? And I have a couple hypotheses about that. Mainly, I think it's that the Republican Party itself is like having an internal reckoning. Not that they think they've gone too far or they're frightened. Like, people keep on saying that there's been this big shift in the Republican Party since like the, January 6th protests, right? And I don't really think that that's been the case. I mean, some people for sure were sort of ostracized for a little bit, but for the most part, they've been warmly re-embraced. Where I do think it's starting to become a problem for them is that there is a wing of the Republican Party that is not answering the kind of traditional donors and leadership of the Republican Party. All you have to do is look at the race for state office here in Texas to see, Abbott is being challenged by, yahoos for sure, but people on his right, and I'm sure Abbott looks like he's going to walk away with it. But I do think that you can see within the party, like the leadership is getting worked up about all these new folks. We talked about it a few weeks ago when we were talking about Nikki Haley in South Carolina. Nikki Haley is now giving speeches at the Heritage Foundation about, this right-wing populism and how those people aren't actually conservative, right? So you are starting to see within like the Republican establishment this pushback. And I think loyal foot soldiers like Crenshaw, I mean, as much as Crenshaw likes to present himself again as an outsider, I mean, this is a boy who went to school in Europe. Like a fancy private school in Europe. This is not a good old boy, who grew up, in Texas. This is a guy who's silver spoon in his mouth his whole life. And he's going to pick up the phone when he gets these kind of calls. So, we'll definitely have to, I definitely want to do a lot more in-depth stuff about actually what the kind of political economy of the Republican Party represents today, because I think there's a lot of nonsense about it sort of now becoming a new working class party, which is certainly not true. But I also think that a lot of people are sort of missing that, like, the fact that, like, there has been a shift in what the GOP represents and who they're answering to. You are starting to see some kind of major donors and extremely wealthy folks move away from the Republican Party toward the Democratic Party. And I think it is worth sort of analyzing what that is. I think the top line answer certainly that both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are not very ideological. When you have two big kind of catch-all parties, you have very incoherent, internal politics. And the fact that there has been a kind of, populist upswing over the past couple of years probably creates some opportunities for more fringe elements to move into power. But again, the Republican Party, the people who vote Republican, the people who run this show are super, super wealthy folks. But again, I don't know, there's a lot to talk about the Republican Party. I think it would be really interesting to maybe do a whole episode in depth on that.
I mean, that's how massive, I guess, unequal our economy is, that populism for the GOP, you look at Boebert and Taylor Greene, and I assume some the other ones you could name, and they're all business owners, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they genuinely do represent populism in the GOP, but of the small,
a small business,
regional,
a small burger populism, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, Boebert literally Smokehouse 1776, right? It's the populism of let me give people diarrhea and not let me pollute the entire river basin. And I mean, of course, they can work together on a lot of things, but sometimes they're not always aligned, especially on their personal sort of ambition, I think.
Yeah, I mean, basically to put a bow on it for now, it's just what you see from that clip is that one, Trumpism sort of did not represent this huge shift from traditional Republican governing, but the theater certainly changed around it. You're seeing tensions within the Republican Party basically around that, because I do think that there is a kind of base of the Republican Party that I think the leadership has lost, sort of management over. And, just like the Democratic Party likes to manage and control their voters, the Republican Party wants to do the same thing.
The Republican Party has a lot less, I think, at least recent muscle memory in terms of doing that. I don't really know what Democratic Party, that's their main bag. They got that shit on lock. GOP, they usually can't afford to.